Hey folks, Brandon Washington coming to you again live. Thank you again for joining me for The Drive. This is a daily show from Tuesday to Friday that I am trying to conceive and come up with. We are trying to have a different topic each day. We'll take some suggestions from the comment boxes. And then also what we want to do is eventually, after about the first month or the second month of doing these small topics, we want to start doing some deep dives into all of the other things that are happening around the world and in your own personal life. I'm hoping that during these hours, this hour that we share each day, that eventually we'll have some live call-ins. We'll take advantage of the wonderful technology that is soon to be coming out through Facebook Live, where you can have two different people talking at the same time. Some people who have Apple iOS already have that functionality. It just depends on if you are invited. So when that technology jumps in, I'm hoping to do some one-on-one talks, and then also we may have some live call-ins. So keep thinking of some suggestions that we can talk about. I'll keep on bringing up small topics and sprinkling in a little bit of information that I know about those topics until we have some long-form discussions, and we'll go from there. Don't forget, yesterday I brought up a new feature for the show that I'm trying to find out if people would like if we continue doing this long form, and that, of course, is the dance break. If you have any suggestions on any dances that can be done safely in a car while driving, please let me know. I will try them out during the dance break, and of course, we will have a dance break today. Okay, so, folks, hey, Chimdi and Karen, good to see you guys. Tell somebody else to watch. The topic for today, I'm going to remind you what the topic was yesterday. We had a quick conversation about personal responsibility. We had a conversation about nationalism and its viability to help end or decrease some gun violence and gang interventions and other forms of violence that are out there. And we talked a little bit about the Americans with Disability Act. None of those topics we talked about yesterday, we didn't do a deep dive into any of them, just sprinkled in a little bit of knowledge about those processes. So hopefully down the road, we can have a longer conversation about those topics. But I wanted to bring up the personal responsibility topic again, because I brought that up yesterday on purpose so that today we could talk about something that is commonly bandied about when talking about personal responsibility, and that is the topic of reparations. I bring up the topic of reparations because people have seemingly started to talk about reparations a lot lately. Oh, and I'm going to pause here for one quick second and say congratulations to Chimdi Nazi. He just had his first baby girl. So anybody who knows Chimdi, please, please, please reach out to that young man and say congratulations, because he has just had a beautiful, beautiful baby girl. And thank God she doesn't look like him. But he is a handsome man as well, and I'm sure the pictures that I've seen of the baby have not been doctored. She is a beautiful young lady. So back to the topic. One of the things that has been jumping up a lot lately is the topic of reparations, and it appears that people are actually seriously taking it for as a real proposal. Some people have put forward some real proposals. Most notably of the people who are putting forward the idea of reparations, one of the Democratic candidates right now, that's Kamala Harris. Now, before we go into that discussion of reparations, the big issue that seems to be popping up for a lot of people is what exactly would reparations be? Because most of the time when we talk about reparations, or people say reparations or anything like that for any minority group, no, folks, we're not just talking about African Americans, we're talking general reparations. Generally, when people start talking about that, they start talking about money and only money. And I thought it was pretty interesting because Kamala Harris brought up the idea of reparations in different forms. One of the things that she brought up is dear to my heart, which is psychology a little mental health training, a bit of help in that aspect of lives. And the way that she put it was the damage and the reputation that slavery had and the ongoing lasting effects that it has have seemingly caused many members of the African American community and others who are associated with that community. Most people are using the phrase DOS, descendants of slaves. There is a notion that many of those people may be suffering from a form of PTSD. Now, of course, many of my fellow military members, first responders, police officers, firemen, whatnot, nurses, people who go through traumatic events on a daily basis typically end up having some form of PTSD. So the logic, if you follow the logic, it would follow that if that type of thing happens from a constant exposure to an extremely turbulent event, you could transpose all of those ideas about those traumatic events, boil them down into a small concoction and say, is it fair to say that some of the treatment and the stigma and simply the history of being a descendant of slaves in this country in particular could cause mental health illnesses, crises, and generally manifest in some of the behaviors that have been typically associated with African Americans and African American communities. And not just African Americans and African American communities, but communities of color. So when we hear that, it makes more sense when we talk about reparations. It sounds more like a process to start a bit of healing. Because if we take a step back from this and look at it from a 1,000-foot point of view, and we look at the situation and we say, okay, slavery, extremely traumatic. However, the people who are alive and well today, or those DOSs, the descendants of slaves, obviously, they're not slaves. And if we look at the situations that many of us in the African American community face, when we compare ourselves to our family members who have passed or were alive during that era of segregation, Jim Crow, most of the folks, or all of the folks who would have been alive during the slavery era, have obviously gone and passed. There are some folks who were still around during segregation and Jim Crow. And what up, Rick? Good to see you, brother. So those folks are still alive, but did many of their children and many of their family members are not affected in the same visceral or physical or mental way that their descendants would have been. And of course, the common logic that would follow along and go with that is that the majority in the country also, being so far removed from the situation, we're talking 200 to 500 years, depending on where you want to put the stop point at, if you consider Jim Crow and the other items that have followed slavery as a continuation of it. Those folks in the majority are far removed from it as well. Hey, Amy, how are you? Good to see you. So, of course, people who happen to be within the majority are apt and maybe well received to say that they didn't do anything to descendants of slaves. Why should they be held accountable or have to bear the brunt of things that their ancestors far in the past have done, and in some cases weren't their ancestors doing those things? Because of course a lot of us don't know our history, and I don't mean African Americans, I mean all people. A lot of us don't know our own backgrounds or history, and it would be pretty difficult to put a pin definitively in some people to say, hey, this person did this, you had slaves, and you were terrible. So it kind of takes the conversation, since we're so far removed from the situation, it takes it out of a context that feels like there's anything that can be done. It takes it out of a context that allows us to have rational conversations about reparations or anything like reparations. And it generally just stops any form of what most people in some of the minority communities seem to be looking for as some kind of gesture to say that what happened wasn't okay and that somebody is accountable for it. Because everybody is always looking for someone to be accountable. But in this situation, it seems like it would be impossible to be able to place some kind of accountability on anyone. So that's why it was so interesting to hear Kamala Harris's perspective on what she believes reparations would be. Now that I've kind of gone through that basic argument of the increased conversations that are being had about reparations, I want to move to a topic of what some have called modern day reparations, which is the concept of UBI. And UBI, of course, stands for Universal Basic Income. Mr. Carter, I see you there. Good to see you. Glad you're watching. Mr. Carter is a member of my family. Happens to be married to my favorite cousin. They have a wonderful family down in the wonderful Atlanta area. And if you ever need a new soccer coach and you want to find out a little bit more information on the Atlanta area, Mr. Carter is the person that you should be asking. I also see Matthew Richter, a fellow friend from high school. Matt was the tallest basketball player in high school, and he happens to be Caucasian. So all of you folks out there, don't think that Caucasian folks can play basketball. Matthew Richter is the person you want to talk to. I also see Jerome Murray. Mr. Murray, California guy, worked at Public Works with me. Wonderful, 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 wonderful person. You ever need to know anything about LA? That is the band to look up. So back to the concept of UBI. Now, UBI and the concept of a universal basic income has been bandied about for the last few years, and especially in libertarian circles, and it's increasingly becoming a more mainstream idea, especially in the age of Bernie Sanders, and especially now that we have a Democratic candidate by the name of Mr. Yang. So those of you who have heard of Andrew Yang are probably well versed in the idea of a universal income. Mr. Yang calls the idea that he is talking about for universal income a freedom dividend. It's a very interesting concept of the way that he is posing this universal basic income. Now, what he is proposing, and again, folks, you should, if you want to get more information on the UBI or any of the topics that we're talking about today, feel free to reach out to me. I will try to give you some good links to anything that we're talking about here. I'll try to go back after these videos and put some of those links or respond to comments in there afterwards. But if you go to Andrew Yang's website, he has a very, very, very well drawn out plan for universal basic income, and his platform for the 2020